Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje eu estou aqui com uma convidada que vai nos trazer um assunto muito interessante. Pela primeira vez, a gente vai trazer aspectos da Idade do Ferro e da Idade do Bronze na Escandinávia. Ela também tem um trabalho muito interessante também relacionado à pesquisa de roupas, de indumentárias, que envolve aspectos desses períodos e também alguns da era viking. Ela também tem um livro muito interessante, que é o Vogue Fashion, né, que é um livro dela muito interessante, relacionado a esses períodos no caso, de construção de manufatura de roupa, de questão de fabricação, no caso do período, de forma arqueológica, e a gente vai aqui conversar com ela justamente para falar um pouco sobre no caso, essa indumentária e esse período para a gente aprofundar um pouco mais. Nicole, thank you so much for being here in the channel. It's an immeasurable pleasure receiving you here. You have a big famous book, I think, the Vogue fashion book about uh, producing clothes, manufacturing clothes in this periods of historical periods that were very important to analyze, because sometimes we don't give much attention to prehistoric periods, and I think it's very necessary to us for comprehend some other periods that we like to see, prehistoric periods. And how do you start your career in your interest for study the Iron and the Bronze Age?
Thank you so much for having me on the channel. It's such a pleasure to be here. No, you're absolutely right. It's a fascinating and huge part of our history that needs to have a little more attention paid to it, because there are so many interesting clues, not just to the culture at those time periods, but as you rightly say, that then helps us to understand the period that follows as well. I know that many Viking reenactors, for example, will actually be doing clothing reproductions from before the Viking Age, because there are so few examples from the Viking Age to actually reference when making historical clothing. For myself, I became interested through many different ways. I have always been a textile crafter from being a very small child. I was first taught by people in my family how to sew and to crochet and things like that. So I've always had busy hands. I can't sit still without doing things. And I know that many of your listeners will be the same. They'll understand me there. And then once I became a little bit older, I learned how to spin. So I've been spinning for about 20 years. And it was all a part of this obsession I have with finding out what came before. So if I was using yarn, for example, to crochet a blanket or something like that, or a hat, I thought, okay, but this yarn was made by a machine. How did people used to make it by hand before there were machines? And that's how I would get into spinning. This is many, many years ago now, when I was just at the start of my journey. I trained as a historian. I am a medievalist originally, but my interest then went backwards in times because, again, I wanted to know what comes before. So I have done lots and lots of research, and continue to craft and to make historical reproductions and things like this for a very long time now. But it was much more recently that I decided to put all of those things together into a book. My background professionally is in education, and I wanted to create a resource that I could be proud of, that I wished had existed back when I was starting out as well. Vogue fashion really is an introduction to late prehistoric textile craft. It's not more complicated than that. It's a good starting place for people who are new to hand sewing, new to reenactment from that period, living history, So it's a very general guideline. It would be amazing to put together a book which is expanded with all the other really interesting bits we had to leave out in interest of space. But yeah, after a career in education, I went back to university to do a master's degree in public history. And the book began its life as a final project for that. And then it quickly became something so much more once I was in touch with Chronocopia Publishing, and we had agreed to turn it into a proper book. But no, I come from it from education standpoint, from a historian standpoint, from a crafter's standpoint, and also from an environmentalist standpoint. I think so many of the ancient skills for textiles are related to almost bushcraft, really, because you're finding raw materials from the landscape and you are using your ancient traditional skills to turn those into useful materials. So that background that I have as well has heavily fed into the project that you see today.
Oh, it's amazing because we have main type of clothes in that period that are very fantastic. We have a part that are colors much more, how can I say, much more like brown, like how can I say, colors that are more monochromatic colors, but
Yes.
they turn into a very colorful when the time passes, and to periods like the Bronze Age to the Viking Age,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
it's a very interesting. I would like to say sorry because I say the word manufacturing, and manufacturing is not a word for that period because manufacturing is from fabric, but they don't have this operation. They have this operation in hand. Sorry for saying this word.
No, don't worry. I think we sometimes think about craft from the very ancient past as being very simple. It's at home, a few people are doing it, and it really comes down to a very basic domestic craftsmanship. And absolutely, cloth was produced in that way for a very long time in many cultures in many places. But beginning in certainly the Bronze Age, there are also centers for production where a whole part of a community and a whole section of the population of that community would have a primary purpose of producing cloth. It wasn't just, oh, we need a bit of cloth for the winter, we need more blankets, let's get down to work. These were very important trade goods for many communities. If you aren't sitting on a copper mine or a tin mine, or you haven't got access to beautiful sources of flint or other goods that people might want to travel with to trade, then wool and flax and cloth would become a really important trade good in your community that you would use to access other kinds of materials that you do not have locally available to you. So with that in mind, there were increasingly in the Bronze Age, people who would make it their specialty to weave, to produce beautiful cloth, not just rough and ready stuff. And some ancient cloth was very rough and could be produced quite quickly and put to multi-purposes. But we'd also have very fine cloth, as fine as the cloth that we would expect to wear on our bodies today. So there is a little bit, we're edging towards not quite factory conditions, but certainly dedicated craft centers where this was made.
Oh, fantastic. It's amazing all that. So we have some specific place that people producing these clothes to serving to the population since long time ago. And
Very
this
long
is
time ago.
fantastic. Know that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to know that we have some examples of clothes that are very interesting from I think, two important humans that are discovered in the archaeological finds. We have the activated girl from the Bronze Age. I think she is one of the most famous women in the world to that
Definitely.
period of the Bronze Age. And we have the Tolland man that was one of the most preserved mummified, uh, how can I say, a corpse that was found in archaeology. And what we can say about these two types of clothes and their use? I think Activate Girl have this circular element, like it's like similar a belt. I can say that probably,
I
but
have just behind me here, this is a reproduction of the Egg-Fed Girls
oh, it's
belt.
so beautiful.
It's really gorgeous, isn't it? I'm showing a belt disc, which is about 16 centimeters in diameter. It's made of pure solid bronze. It has beautiful swirling decorations on the outside, and it has a long pointy spike in the middle. And that it was worn on her belt around her waist. And that's not unique to Egg-Fed Girl. Hers is of a moderate size. There are others from other burials in Denmark, which are larger, some are smaller, but there are many, many of these bronze belt discs found in the archaeology for Bronze Age Denmark. And it seems to have been a real statement piece in the southern Scandinavian Bronze Age. We do not know exactly what it means, what it was for, who would wear them, and when and why. It's likely to indicate that that person had some special role in their society, possibly to do with the sun cults, possibly to do with their position in society in terms of their prominence in society. But these are guesses because no written records from this time remain. And there's, of course, no one alive today to tell us why people wore them, what they were for. Big statement pieces of bronze seems to have been increasingly important for people in the Bronze Age. But for the Egg-Fed Girl, what was even more spectacular about her burial was her clothing. Other examples of bronze discs had been found previously in the 19th century, so that was not unusual. What was unusual was her short skirt made of strings, and that there was no parallel to that at the time when she was discovered in 1921. People had previously found Bronze Age women's clothes that were heavy and long and covered over the body, but Egg-Fed Girl's string skirt fell above the knee. The strings did not have anything to keep them together except their own weight. So if you moved, if you danced in the outfit, it would show your thigh, show your bum a little bit perhaps. So it was considered almost scandalous that ancestors from that part of the world would wear such a skirt. It seemed really impractical. It seemed to draw attention to that part of the body. But those kinds of skirt weren't strange either. Egg-Fed Girls was the most complete one by far of any string skirt that had ever been found. But fragments of string skirts have been found in more than 40 locations in the southern Scandinavian Bronze Age world, often because they were decorated with little tubes of bronze that would shine and jingle as you moved in the skirt. In a grave context, often all that's left is the little tubes, sometimes with a bit of string still oxidized inside that tube, indicating that it had been around strings originally. So we know that it was quite common. Examples or fragments have been found in the graves of very small children, as well as a very old woman who was 35 years old when she died, and everyone in between. So it seems to have been a fairly common garment for women, though precisely, again, when and why it was used, it's hard to say. There are bronze figurines showing the same skirt being worn, but by people in beautiful acrobatic poses, so possibly as a dance costume or a ritual costume. But we're all still guessing because it's it's interesting, but we don't have any for certain answers.
Oh, it's a very, very interesting to see that, because we have an object that she was using, and it's very different, and it's big. It's similar, sometimes a belt, sometimes
Hmm.
an object that she was using for a purpose. But it's very interesting
Mm.
to see how the her clothes are very preserved, like the Tolson man, and this is fantastic to see these two.
It really is. It's so interesting. Toland Man is interesting because he was probably wearing more clothes when he went into the ground than he appears. Right now, he's naked except for the strap around his neck that killed him, and a belt and a leather cap. So often with bog burials specifically, material that is animal fiber based, specifically wool and leather, is really well preserved because of the acidic and low oxygen, cold, dark environment that you get in a peat bog. But material like linen disappears because it just becomes peat. It rots. Because it's a plant fiber, it rots and becomes the peat in the soil. So when we're looking for linen preservation, we are sometimes left with impressions of the weave against other materials. And the most famous example that I can think of there is the Huldremoser woman, who is Denmark's most famous Iron Age bog body, who had a beautifully preserved wool skirt. She had beautifully preserved wool scarf and a sheepskin cape, but nothing else. And that doesn't seem like a full outfit. And it wasn't. Very careful examination of the skin on her back and shoulders showed up the impression of a plant fiber garment that she was wearing, as well as the skirt and the scarf and the capes. We cannot tell the full shape of that garment or the size. We think it probably went from her shoulders to somewhere above the knee. But we can tell that it was made of plant fiber. We can tell that it was tabby woven or plain woven. We can tell roughly the gauge of the weaving, so how fine it was. And just from the most tiny fragments of actual fiber left on her skin, the guess is that it was most likely a nettle fiber shirt, but could potentially have been flax or linen as well. So it's little details like that that we have to find when we're looking for linen in a bog body context. Linen is usually preserved better by dry conditions, by warm conditions, or by fire when it's carbonized, and will be preserved in its structure that way better.
Oh, it's amazing because these two different types we can solve that have some aspects that we can say, oh, they have this type of how can I say, contact with that, with this plant, with this food in that day. Sometimes some risks in some aspects of in that clothing, in this very interesting to analyze this data, because they have a specific things. Activist girl, if I remember, she was found with some seeds of some plants in her
Yeah,
body.
there were, so when you look at the botanical remains, this is archaeobotany, and it tells us so much about the context of the burial. It can tell us what season of the year the person was buried in. It can tell us what was growing in the immediate area when they were buried. It can tell us something about what they ate. One of the most important bits of evidence for linen, for flax and linen production in Western and Northern Europe, isn't preserved textile. It's the presence of flax seed in living contexts on sites where archaeology has been done. It's an incredibly important part of what we do today. as researchers, I'm not an archaeologist. I read archaeological reports and I translate them for a general audience. That's more what I do. But it's also a bit of a shame because so many of these prehistoric textile finds are themselves historical. They were found maybe in the 19th century, before the normal procedures of archaeology were established, or before the modern technologies that we have were available to people. So the way that things were dug up often is not, absolutely not how archaeology would be conducted today. It means that evidence was never gathered or lost and is not now recoverable. Archaeobotany is a really good example of that. You know, that was not something that people were thinking about in the early 19th century, even later on as well. So it means that you lose that context for finds of that time period. And I've said this many times, that when you're looking at historical archaeological finds, the notes, the commentary that you see along with those will often tell us more about the people who did the finding of the objects than the people that the objects belong to. One really good example of that is the report that came out about the finds from the Thorsberg Moor in Germany. Lots of absolutely gorgeous pieces of clothing, cloaks, trousers, a tunic found in this moor. And the comment was that all of the pieces appeared to be male clothing. There was nothing related to female clothing at Thorsberg. But of course, that shows off their assumptions about what men wore and what women wore, that they would see a pair of trousers and make the assumption this has to be a man's garment. Even something as universal as a cloak, they would say, oh, this is a man's garment. They were allowing their assumptions to color their commentary. And I think we're better today. We're not out of that scenario. I think we always have to recognize we have our own bias. But it's really clear when you look at historical finds that they are letting lots of their current ideas about gender and class color their commentary about ancient finds, where maybe it shouldn't do.
Oh, it's very, very interesting, because all this is allied to us comprehend how much the life of these people are so fascinating, interesting to see how these finds, and principally codes and some aspects of people have to live in these areas. And one of the most interesting thing when we think about clothes and how they are produced and how they are constructed, and it's interesting because they have colors, they have the way of they are made, and how the clothes in the Iron and Bronze Age are made in that period. It's very interesting, fascinating. I have very curiosity about that.
It's a very interesting thing to look at. When the Bronze Age happens, yes, there is more metal, there is bronze, and that's is what the period is named after. But that's because bronze survives in the ground. And when you're looking at the archaeology, you're seeing bronze, 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 bronze. You can categorize it, you can catalog it, you can see changes over time and in place about bronze, because it survives. I think if fabric survived as well as bronze did, we might have to rethink the periods of history as to changes in textile technology. In the Bronze Age is when people start to use sheep's wool as the main fabric for making clothing, for weaving with. We definitely have weaving in the Neolithic, so the end of the Stone Age. We've got warp-weighted looms. We have really good evidence of plant textile fiber being used. But from the Neolithic onwards, sheep are bred that have wool which is long enough and soft enough to spin it into thread that can be woven. This begins around 6,000 years ago in the Near East, and sheep breeding and the material start to travel west through Europe through the next few centuries and millennia. So definitely by about 2000, in Western Europe, we are using sheep's wool to weave. The process begins by plucking the wool from your sheep. This is not a time when people were cutting the wool off sheep. Sheep shed their wool naturally, and you would help it along by combing the sheep, grabbing the wool off the sheep. And you could comb it apart into the very woolly fine fibers and the hairy fibers, or you could comb it all together into one kind of wool. That is then spun into fine thread, and then the loom is set up with the warp and the weft thread in exactly the same way as cloth is then made for thousands of years afterwards, right? We have a very early establishment of that technology. Things get more fine, you get new weave patterns emerge as the Bronze Age goes on into the Iron Age, into the Viking Age. But the basic tools, the basic techniques stay the same. However, in the Bronze Age, and we have lots of evidence for clothing in the Bronze Age, specifically from Denmark, that shows us that people were treating wool fabric very similarly to how they were treating leather when they were making clothing out of that material instead. So they would make a fairly coarse wool fabric. They would then felt it. They would rough up the surface. They would make it so that it was all matted together. It would make a very smooth surface to the fabric, so it looked really even if the weaving wasn't. And then you would take that felted fabric and you would cut into it and sew it into shapes in a very similar way that you might use to create, for example, a tunic out of a deer pelt or a sheep's pelt. So we might have some evidence there of old tailoring traditions from the Neolithic coming forward into the Bronze Age. They also cut often their cloaks into oval shapes and then use the offcuts from that to create inner garments as well, specifically for the men. And that's an interesting feature as well. What you do sense, though, is that people were very aware of the value of the fabric. Lots of work went into making it, so you're going to use every piece of it. Nothing was going to go to waste. That idea carries on then into the future. With the Iron Age, you have lots of huge advances in making cloth. You had people using more twill than plain weave, for example, a much more complex form of weaving that produced beautiful patterns in the cloth, but also that produced cloth which drapes better, it fits the body better, and it keeps the weather out better. Because the thread is closer together. You also have people using color extensively for the first time. Lots of plant dyeing is going on, lots of patterning in the clothing as well. And people were weaving their clothing on the loom to the exact measurement that they needed it for the finished garment. So rather than making a big piece and cutting it, they were saying, right, we need for a skirt fabric exactly this wide and this long. That's how big we're going to make it, and we'll put it together. Or the Riepsholt tunic is a really good example from like the 1st to 4th century CE. Again, a later Iron Age piece. And it was woven as one piece, sleeves and all, which is possible on a warp-weighted loom. And then all they had to do was take it off and sew it together, and it was done. So there was no waste. People were being very careful with their fabric. And we see evidence to lots of repairing and reuse. and rewearing and reshaping as time went on. People did not have a garment once, and once they wanted a new one, they threw it away. They were making really good use of their fabric right through into the Viking Age.
Oh, it's amazing. And when we think about the jewelry and use of
Mm.
accessories, how we can say that you have a specific moments that, oh, this is designated to the woman's, this is designated to the men's, or men's using neck every time using necklaces, or this is a thing that in Viking Age we have much more this use of the jewelry, or
Mm.
no, it's in that two period in this
Mm.
two periods
Mm.
it's common to see.
Yeah.
uh,
I think with jewelry, it's interesting because so often with a grave, everything is gone except for a few pieces that will survive in the ground: a pot, a pin, beads. So it's not always possible to tell the gender of the person who was buried there. And again, this comes into the assumptions that are made. If a beautiful necklace is found, the assumption will often be, oh, it was a woman's grave. And sometimes that's true, sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not possible to tell. I think what you do see often is regional variety. So specific kinds of necklaces are associated with particular places, particular cultures. So in Bronze Age Ireland, for example, you get these really beautiful solid gold neck rings, which are shaped like moons. They're called lunula, little moons. And they can be plain or they can be punched with a pattern. And they sit just here around the neck and then curve around the back of the neck. With Bronze Age Britain, they were obsessed with beads. They absolutely loved beads and multi-strand bead necklaces. Those could be amber was the most popular kind, but you would also see lots of jet and shale and bone and clay beads as well. Less glass, a little bit of faience, but some just starting to come in. Lots of necklaces made up of many different materials. Lots of contrast, black against white and things like that. Very, very beautiful, very striking. And that seems to have been quite common, especially in the southern part of Britain up to sort of Midlands. Over in Denmark, you have, again, solid bronze cuffs. You've got amber necklaces again, lots of amber necklaces. So a good variety of different things there. But it was pretty clear that people enjoyed adorning themselves. They liked wearing jewelry, whether it was finger rings or bracelets or necklaces. If you had a few beads, you would wear them. And we sometimes find graves of people with just a single bead or just a few beads. That's it, but they're clearly being worn by the person in the grave. Sometimes a combination of new material and things they would have inherited from the family, older pieces. So they had meaning as well as beauty to people. And sometimes they would travel a very great distance. At the Must Farm site in Cambridgeshire, which was found quite recently, there were blue glass beads there from Egypt. And this is 950 BCE. So, you know, even in this tiny little corner of Britain, you had beads being traded from very, very far away. So they were clearly valued and they would travel well as a trade good, and people loved them and wore them.
Oh, it's it's a very curious thing to see, because we have these transitions of tastes for jewelry, and
Mm.
we see that we have jewelry that are much more like the using of gold, the
Mm.
using of um, metallics materials, and we saw, how can I say, after that we saw much more using of glass,
Mm.
of other materials that complement these metallic materials, and this is very, very interesting to see how things begin to how can I say, much more expensive, I think, and transition to others objects that are not so if we have these notions of today that are not so, how can I say, not so much expensive in terms of
Yeah.
values, because gold, I think it's a material very, very expensive, and glass probably in that period is expensive too, but it's we saw that this have this difference because everything was made in a lot in
Mm,
gold, if we
mm.
see in Iron Age and sometimes in Bronze Age, but Viking Age come to other materials to complement that, and this is very interesting. So
It's so true. And even if you have just a little bit of gold, you would make it go a long way. You know, you would maybe use bronze or shale or some less expensive material that would then have a gold foil covering it over top. And that's a technique that uh, was there in the Bronze Age, continued in the Iron Age, continued through into the Anglo-Saxon and Viking worlds as well and beyond, because you did want to make the most of what you had. And gold, similarly to bronze, when it's polished, when it's very fresh and new looking, it reflects that color of the sun. And I think it's one thing to know that bronze and gold are beautiful in as an idea, but I think, and I know many of your listeners and yourself will know this as well, as soon as you go into a reenactment scenario and you're sitting at night around a fire, that color of the gold or of the bronze really shines. It becomes a very clear sign of your wealth, your taste, because you're literally shining in the dark when you wear that. And glass would be similar because it captures light and it reflects light. And glass also comes in lots of beautiful colors. I think even before the time when people were wearing colorful clothing, when your clothing is fairly plain, it doesn't mean you don't like color. You still love color, and you're going to wear pieces of jewelry that really stand out against a plain background or in darkness. So it's those living situations. It's that lifestyle which can help us to understand people's love of certain kinds of materials. I think beyond the fact that they are very expensive, they're very costly. They also have qualities that make them very special in the way that they were living at the time.
oh, it's a very beautiful perspective because I didn't have this idea that we using these sometimes these materials, and when we are in set in the fire, they are shine sometimes when, and this is have a beautiful perspective of that. I don't have to think that idea. You give us a very beautiful perspective of that,
You
of
definitely
this
see
material.
in the Viking sagas, you often hear reference to gold shining in firelight. And we think of gold as being yellow, but often gold is referred to as red in sagas. And when you think about it, yeah, that's the color it shines in firelight. It's red. So it's a nice little textual evidence for where these kinds of ideas come from too.
Oh, amazing. And when we think about this specific lighting or color, we are references of a god or a goddess in this time. Odin
Mm.
is this reference of the sun, or no? It's another perspective. Sun is considered his own god.
That's a really good question. And the spiritual beliefs of people that far ago are not clear to us at all. We have clues, we have cultural practices which are really interesting to us, but which don't give us detail because, again, there's no written sources. In the Bronze Age, well, is a very long time period and a very large geographical area. Certainly there was interest in the sun, the moon, and the stars. Certainly in southern Scandinavia and in Britain, there are beautiful pieces of jewelry and other objects which would seem to show the sun in the sky, sometimes being drawn by horses on a wagon. So that gives us a clue as to how people thought the world worked, potentially. Or ships carrying the sun, that's another interesting one as well. We have symbols that that we think are related to the sun, which are repeated in rock art and in jewelry. We get a sense possibly of some ancestor worship. There are monuments in the landscape, and certainly in mainland Europe, but in Britain, where I live, there are many, many, many spectacular monuments in the landscape, dating from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age. And these clearly form some spiritual function. They were likely to be gathering places, and they were positioned in the landscape very carefully. It could have been between two tribal areas, for example, or at the edge of someone's known territory. There seems to have been a real interest in Bronze Age Britain, particularly about places between places. So where the sea meets the land, or at the edge of a river, or where one landscape leads to another kind of landscape. These places are often hidden in the landscape, so they're not visible from all around. You need to approach it from a certain way to see it. There are causeways of stones, stone rows, stone roads. There are circles, there are dips, there are cairns. You see burial mounds reused for generations and generations and generations, showing that people clearly wanted their new dead to spend time with their old dead. You know, so there are these interesting hints as to how people viewed the world and themselves within it, but nothing really, really clear. Certainly in the Iron Age, there were spirits and gods associated with certain places, certain peoples. And when you have the first Romans going and Greeks traveling and writing about various places, they would mention that there were cults or temples or centers focused around a particular deity. And then the Romans would say, oh, that must be Mars by a different name. So they would see the culture they were observing in Britain or observing in the Celtic world as having cognates, as having equivalents in the Roman world. So potentially they're a sort of polytheistic religion. But again, these were the writings of outsiders looking in, not of the people themselves. And even where there's a strong written mythological tradition, for example, in Wales, which harkens back to that earlier time period and the wealth of mythology associated with that area, the written sources are much, much later, recounting oral stories from the more distant past, in a similar way to how for the Viking world, the Eddas being written down are centuries after the culture that they seem to show. And so we have to be very careful with these written sources because they're so distant from the original.
Oh, it's a very interesting point because we can saw that have a lot of these how can I say influences of aspects of the mythology and some aspects that influence the perspective of the using of these materials for these traditions that you are reflecting, this thinking. So the sun is a god, the perspective of using gold or using colors that have a transmit these aspects, and this is a very kind thing to see. And one of the most interesting thing that I was observing about all this aspect is what we can have at some point that we say, oh, this defined that this is Iron Age, this is Bronze Age, this is Viking. Have some these aspects that you consider that this is a point that you say, oh, this is reflecting what is Iron and Bronze Age. In your opinion, what do you think?
Okay, I mean, so many tests that we can apply to organic material, to certain minerals in the ground and stratification will give us a specific date for a period, for an object that's found. It's possible to say, yes, this is definitely from this period. That's harder to do, of course, with material that was found historically and then was put in storage or cleaned or preserved in some way, so that those tests are either not possible to conduct or the results are unreliable. That's when we have to start looking at the form of the piece, of the fabric, how it was made, to give you a clue. So, and this has actually led to some misunderstanding over time. I'm thinking now of the Rylestone fabric, which was found in the 19th century. And this is from North Yorkshire, oak coffin burial. And for many, 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 many years, it was assumed to be Bronze Age because of the form that the fabric took. It was undyed. It was sort of medium coarse tabby weave, just exactly the kind of cloth you would expect in the Bronze Age. But then when it was radiocarbon dated, it was found actually to be early Iron Age. So potentially centuries after it was thought to be originally. So sometimes we get caught out because some clothing traditions or weaving traditions just carried on exactly the same for such a long time. But to answer your question, I think if you are looking at material which has had dye applied to it, so it's an artificial color, if you're looking at twill fabrics, if you're looking at clothing with lots of volume in the material, very fine, then you're looking at Iron Age or later. With the Iron Age, it would seem that more people wore separates, women wore separates, rather than a long dress that we associate with the Viking Age, for example. And it's hard to say if this did continue into the Viking Age, but Huldrum was a woman who I mentioned earlier, who dates from the sort of 1st century BCE to possibly the 3rd century CE or AD. She was wearing a separate blouse and skirt. We have the woman of Lonahedda, who was wearing a separate top and bottom. This happens again and again. It's a very practical kind of clothing. So whether that was happening anywhere in the Viking Age is hard to say. The evidence that we get from iconographic sources, so carvings and drawings, would suggest not. But that so separates for women we would associate more with the Iron Age than in later periods. I should say, sorry, the Bronze or the Iron Age, because in the Bronze Age, women were also wearing separate tops and bottoms. Not exclusively, they were also wearing tubular garments and pinned and belted, which was a style that reemerged then as well in the Anglo-Saxon period and beyond, and became the apron dress in the Scandinavian Viking Age. But yeah, pieces which are brought to the body by folding and pleating and gathering is something that has always been done, because if you have one outfit, you're going to need to have it be really flexible and change with you. So that's been quite common. So as we get more into the early medieval period, that's when we see more tailored clothing as well, things that are made to shape at the body. There's lots of little different ways that we tell the difference, but really there is so little in the way of hard and fast evidence in the form of archaeological finds, complete garments, that it's difficult to make rules. It's hard to say, this is definitely so for this period, this is definitely so for this period, because there's too little evidence to be certain about what was happening broadly. We can say that this was done in this particular circumstance, this suggests the following, but we can't take a harder line than that, really.
Oh, it's an idea that was very interesting to solve that, because we have some specific things that define this period, and we have the using of some specific type of, or the way of we use some clothes that define this periods, and this is fantastic to see that, because in some periods the history say, oh, clothing that are very shortly is not good to show the body parts, but in that period it's not a thing that is offensive, or it's a common thing to use. And
yeah, I think once we're in the early medieval period, once it becomes sort of state sanctioned Christianity and things, you do start to see more rules come in as to women's clothing, the length of garments, the fit of shirts, the size of necklines. All of these different things seem to start becoming more rigid in that society. I think it's safe to say, and other researchers in this field say the same, that the way that we dress ourselves today has more in common with the way that people were dressing in the Iron Age than in later periods in history. Because, and again, we're hampered by the fact that we don't have that many garments to study, but there seems to be such variety that things like the gender norms for clothing were looser in a similar way to how they are today. The fact that people were wearing separates, the fact that people were wearing very practical clothing that was designed to be moved in and work in, was again more in common with the Iron Age than with later periods immediately following. So I think it was quite common. I think it still is common to look at sumptuary laws, to look at rules that came in for the early medieval period and apply them going backwards. But I think when we do that, we've got to be quite careful to see whether that's appropriate or not.
Oh, fantastic. And for our last question, Ms. DeRushie, I would like to question you, how much these two periods have his influence in the Viking Age, the Iron and the Brooms?
Yeah.
How much the Viking Age using these things that the hereditary for these two periods, and say we using some of these things or adapted things to our period, example.
Yeah, no, good. I mean, looking at the Bronze Age is a really, really long time ago, right? We are so much closer to the Viking Age now in 2025 than the Vikings were to the Iron Age, to the Bronze Age rather. So we're talking huge amounts of time to have gone. But the fact that wool and linen were the main fabrics that were in use in the Bronze Age continues to be true into the Viking Age. The fact that you have people spinning on drop spindles or splicing linen in order to produce fabric, that remains the same. We had new kinds of weaving, twill weaving, diamond patterning, diagonal patterning, all these different kinds of beautiful twill weaves that continue to be used into the Viking Age. The plants used to dye fabric in the Iron Age continue to be used in the Iron Age, in the Viking period. I think especially by the later Iron Age, so the Roman Iron Age, the post-Roman Iron Age, in Scandinavia specifically, and in northern Germany, you have pretty well established the standard outfit elements that people are going to be wearing on a daily basis. So for men, that's a woolen tunic, possibly a linen under tunic if you can afford one, if you have one. Trousers, leg wraps, cloak, hat, socks, belt pouch. So the sort of classic look that you see on male Viking reenactors is really well established by the end of the Iron Age. And every time someone has been found who was buried fully clothed, who was identifiably a man, that's basically what they were wearing. It would seem that in the later Iron Age, some women were wearing trousers too. But again, the evidence for that is fairly scanty. The Detgen trousers and the Marksetzel trousers were both, at points in their history, thought to have been worn by women. But I think you'd struggle to get away with that if you were in the Viking Age or a Viking Age reenactor as a woman. For women, again, tunics, longer usually. The separates from the Iron Age seems to disappear. We're replacing that with more of a dress or an apron dress over a longer tunic. So those things do change, possibly, well, definitely because the culture is changing and people's expectations are changing. But the fabric that's being used, the stitches that are being used, the way that garments are edged using woven bands or cords, all of those things are leftovers from the Iron Age. All of those things are well established by the late Iron Age. So even though it's a bit odd that for the Viking Age, people are looking at fashions hundreds of years earlier to inspire their Viking Age clothing, it's not too bad because they're not too far off the mark when they do that. We've certainly got a lot of similarities between the two periods.
Oh, yes, it's amazing. So that many of the things that they use have a permanence in the Viking Age. You say that have the way of the stitching, the way of using some aspects of, principally, I think bronze. They have much influence, and if you have the period like the Vandal era, and this contribute to unite with the perspectives of the Viking Age, the perspective of using elements of the gods like Odin that was passing for Viking Age to use some pieces like bracteates. This is fantastic. So that clothing continues some aspects of that. And I would like to invite you to talk about your book, Vogue Fashion, for people here in the channel that don't know about the book, but that we would like to interest, because it's a fantastic book, and I think people would love to know much more about it.
Thank you. So Vogue Fashion is a general introduction to later prehistoric fashion and textile traditions in the north and west of Europe and Britain. And it really is an introductory guide to that. It brings together a lot of different sources, a lot of which are not easily accessible by people. And it turns that information into a guide that is practical and accessible to people. There's something in there for a lot of different kinds of people. If you are a reenactor, living historian, experimental archaeologist, then there's information in there for you. If you are interested in sustainable fashion, environmentally friendly fashion, then this is a good book for you as well, because it helps us to understand that a lot of the practices that we would like to have today of reducing and reusing material, of earth-friendly materials and dyes, these are just really, really old traditions that we've lost sight of and maybe need to bring back again. If you're new to hand sewing, but would like some guidance on how to make your own clothes for the first time, those kinds of instructions are in the book as well. It's sort of divided in half. There's the first half is general information about lots of topics about textiles. The second half of the book is 13 projects that you can make at home using the instructions in the book that will give you garments and accessories that are not just appropriate for use in a historical setting, but which also you could wear as part of an everyday wardrobe today. So I hope that it's got something for everybody. It's been a huge amount of fun to research and to write, and it's hopefully going to be the first of other books to come as well. So that's quite exciting.
Oh, it's fantastic. And I would like to thank you so much for being here and doing this interview, because I was searching for a person that talking about the Scandinavian Iron and Bronze Age principally, and was difficult to find, but I received a person that indicated me to call you for talking about aspects of clothes, of this, or about the three periods since the Iron to the Viking, and this is fantastic. Thank you so much.
It's been
Nicole.
A real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I will just stop the recording.
Yeah, that went really nice. So that's great.